A few days after the Japanese attacked the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war against the United States. The question why Hitler declared war is not that straightforward, since unlike with his various other decisions, there is little to no paper trail. Luckily, in the last few years, a German historian, namely Dr. Klaus Schmider, who is a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and has worked there since 1999, took a closer look at the various German primary sources, and he will join us a few times throughout this video to provide insights that he covered in his book Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation: Why Germany Declared War on the United States. According to Dr. Schmider, 3 areas require our focus. First, the situation on the Ostfront, so the war against the Soviet Union. Second, the Japanese joining the Axis in the war against the Allies. And finally, the changes in US policy, particularly over the course of 1940 to 1941. One common misconception is that Hitler had nothing but contempt for the United States. This is not completely unfounded, since he made quite negative remarks about the United States and/or Americans during the war. Yet those are generally rather rare compared to what Hitler wrote in the 1920s about the United States, which was quite or even very positive at times. Dr. Schmider will give you a brief overview about Hitler's pre-war views on the United States.
It is highly misleading to see in Hitler somebody who is just, you could say, instinctively disgusted by anything he sees in the United States of the interwar years, as some of his wartime speeches would appear to suggest. In fact, a comparison of recordings of private conversations, publications, as well as memoirs by acolytes and hangers-on, give us the image of somebody who views the United States as a power to be reckoned with and even to be admired. He has a very clear view of the country's economic power, of its future economic prospects. He approves, hardly a surprise, of racist legislation, which is passed in the 1920s. And he also sees it as a country which, by and large, is still, he tends to see it as a country which rests on good racial stock, with North Europeans still making up a relative majority of its population. One has to look really hard for comments about that, essentially seeing this country one that is doomed to descend into corruption by virtue of the fact that it is supposedly in the hands of a Jewish elite. I mean, such comments do become more frequent, but only as World War II breaks out, moves into a German-American Cold War, and ultimately hostilities between both sides break out. Furthermore, he is impressed by what he sees, you could say, the egalitarian structure of American societies, where immigrants, who according to him very often represent the best of their generation, are given equal access to a system of education that will guarantee that they will go on to lead productive lives as citizens. All these factors combined, in his eyes, make the United States into a power that, likely as not, will become Germany's key challenger in the near future.
So next, let us look at the Ostfront. For the Germans, the fight against the Soviet Union was the most important one. All other fronts were for a long time just considered a sideshow. In this case, we only look at the situation broadly in 1941. In June 1941, the German forces and its allies invaded the Soviet Union. In early July 1941, Chief of the General Staff of the German Army High Command, General Halder, assumed that the war was won. Already on 11th August 1941, he noted in his diary that he made a mistake and that the Red Army was underestimated, noting that the Soviet divisions are not armed, equipped, and led along German standards. Something that might sound oddly familiar again. Yet that doesn't matter since the divisions keep coming. This pattern of repeated German victories that are then followed by renewed Soviet resistance continues over the course of 1941. The Battle of Kiev in August to September 1941 was another major defeat for the Soviet Union. To quote Glantz, 4 Soviet field armies consisting of 43 divisions, 450,720 men, and 3,867 guns and mortars had ceased to exist. The Southwestern Front, like the Western Front before it, had to be recreated using roughly 15,000 men who escaped encirclement. Then in October 1941, the Battle of Vyazma-Bryansk was concluded. The grand total of Soviet formations trapped at Vyazma-Bryansk came to 64 rifle divisions, 11 tank brigades, and 50 artillery regiments. To put this in context, Germany at the start of the war in 1939 had about 100 divisions and attacked the Soviet Union with around 150. Of course, as previously mentioned, they can't be compared one to one. Then the Germans marched against Moscow until they had to stop in early December 1941, which was followed by the first parts of the Soviet counteroffensive on 5th December 1941. Hitler declared war on the United States on the 11th December. Of course, with hindsight, this seems like a very bad idea, yet we need to look at the situation in December 1941. Although the Soviet counteroffensive turned out to be successful, this was clearly not apparent in this time frame. First, the counteroffensive was far less straightforward than we often think. Stahel notes that the offensive began in earnest on 6th December, but even that is simplified. Contrary to some popular representations of the winter fighting, the Soviet counteroffensive did not begin everywhere along Army Group Center's front on December 6th. It developed in a staggered fashion. Second, for the Germans, it was just another of many counterattacks of the Red Army that was also not particularly sophisticated. The rate of advance was generally slow, and Soviet troop leaders proved to be as yet inexperienced in the conduct of offensive operations. Thus, before this was expressly forbidden by Western Front High Command on December 13, 1941, they attacked mostly frontally along the roads, with no sense that it was essential to bypass enemy points of resistance and get as deep as possible in the enemy's flank and rear. As such, for Hitler the situation was very likely nothing to be concerned about. Keep also in mind that the fighting on the Eastern Front since 1941 was a constant back and forth. Yet German troops won and advanced. Next, let us look at the role of Japan. The situation was quite complicated, as further explained in my video on why Japan declared war on the United States. For Japan, China was very important, yet in this video we look mostly on the German side. So let us jump right in. The diary of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, the Wehrmachtsführungsstab, noted about the Japanese on the 17th February 1941. According to the report of the Special Staff for Trade, War and Economic Measures, it seemed certain that Japan did not desire war with the United States, would not take on England unless Germany struck a decisive blow against the latter, and in the meantime would do everything possible to increase its readiness for war with German assistance. Of course, for the long run, this was not in the interest of Germany. Dr. Schmider will give you now a brief overview about Japan's stance towards Germany in 1941.
As far as Japan is concerned, Hitler's view of it is completely pragmatic. Contrary to what the memoirs of one of his senior aides, Hanfstengel, imply, he does not have an emotional attachment of any kind to them. He sees the Empire of Japan as a country that is likely to fall foul of the Western powers at some point. He sees Japan as a country that even when not engaged in war actively is likely to check United States influence in the South Pacific and is likely to limit the British Empire's options in other theaters of war. What does this mean in a practical sense? It means that from about the summer of 1940 onwards, attempts are made to somehow bring Japan into the coalition of the Axis in a way that will serve German interests. Crucially, this should not be confused with a German desire to get Japan engaged in a war with the United States. That's never the case. Throughout this period of 1940-41, with the possible exception of a couple of weeks in March, April 1941, the German leadership is not interested in the prospect of bringing the Americans into the war. Japan is to manipulate it in such a way, and this is the crucial part, that the Japanese leadership will not succumb to the temptation of somehow mending fences with the Western powers. Diplomatic talks between Japan and the United States that begin in April 1941 for some time appear to suggest such a possibility, and that's what is feared by the German leadership. So, rather surprisingly, in early July, a change of policy occurs in Berlin. In the previous months, considerable diplomatic effort had been expended in convincing the Japanese to confront the British and the dominions in Southeast Asia. Now all of a sudden, targets are switched. When an opportunity to do so appears to present itself, and it is suggested that Japan initiate hostilities against the Soviet Union instead. This is not, and this is very important, this is not because Germany feels that she's going to need Japanese support to defeat the Soviet Union. This is merely seen as an opportunity that will wreck any prospect whatsoever for that Japanese moderates might have to still find an accommodation with the United States. As long as that road to peace is blocked, the German leadership in the summer of 1941 will rest contented.
Time to take a look about the aspects about US policy in 1941 and how the German leadership assessed its role. For this we look at various German reports in 1941. On 9th January 1941 the following was noted in the War Diary of the Wehrmacht's Operations Staff. Up to now, Hitler had acted according to the principle of always smashing the most important enemy positions in order to get one step further. Therefore, Russia would now have to be smashed. Either the British would then give way, or Germany would continue the struggle against Great Britain under favorable circumstances. The destruction of Russia would also make it possible for Japan to turn against the USA with all its forces. This would deter the latter from entering the war. At this point, Hitler tried to keep the United States out of the war. The following quote is a situation assessment by Hitler from 20th January 1941. Although important here, it was done in front of Mussolini, the Italian Foreign Minister Ciano, and 3 Italian generals. Why is this important? This means the assessment was very likely adapted towards the Italian audience. As such, downplaying the US capabilities should be taken with a grain of salt. From America, even if it enters the war, I do not see a great danger. The greater one is the huge bloc of Russia. We have very favorable political and economic treaties with Russia, but I prefer to rely on my means of power. 2 points to add here. First, strictly speaking, at this point in time the US would not have been an immediate major threat, since it would still need some time to get the war machine going. Still further actions by Hitler indicate that he wanted to keep the US out of the war. Second, keep in mind that Hitler before the war was very aware of the economic power of the United States, although he might have underestimated the speed the US could gear up for war. This seems to be underlined by General Halder's diary entry about Hitler's talk to his general on 30th March 1941. He wrote, "England is pinning its hopes on America and Russia. Peak performance not for 4 years. Russia's transportation problems." In April 1941, the orders for Bismarck and Prinzregent were not to attack US merchant vessels and also respect the US neutrality zone. Now this zone in 1939 originally was only about 300 miles into the Atlantic from the US East Coast, yet it was extended later. In April 1941, the Americans extended their own security zone far out into the Atlantic to the line of 26 degrees west, just west of Iceland. Additionally, later orders for the Bismarck and Prinzregent were what Schmider called close to being self-defeating. The orders from May 1941 about US Navy ships trailing the German task force and signaling the task force position openly was not to engage, and such behavior would have to be accepted. These orders indicate that avoiding a conflict with the US was more important and that Hitler likely downplayed the US strength while talking with Mussolini and his generals. Yet US policy over the course of 1941 became more involved into the war. Another major step by the US in 1941 was the occupation of Iceland. Originally, Iceland was part of Denmark. After the capitulation in 1940, the British occupied Iceland. And in July 1941, the US took over. Now this was done by US Marines because they were volunteers and thus Roosevelt could act without the approval of the US Congress. Now at first it seems to be a move with limited consequences, but once you have a base somewhere, you need to supply it. So US convoys that were protected by US warships were used to supply Iceland, and British merchant ships were welcome to join these convoys. These joint convoy operations also served as a foundation for future cooperation between the US and the Royal Navy. The US occupation of Iceland was in the first part of July. Yet still, on 21st July 1941, General Halder noted about another Hitler's lecture in his diary. US entry into the war unlikely for now. After all, hectic policy allows for surprises. Efforts to help by resupply are running increasingly toward Basra. Be aware that Basra might not be entirely correct here. Basra at one point was an important part of the US Persian Gulf Command. Yet according to an article from the National Museum of the United States Army, Basra was not that important before March 1942. Anyway, due to the operations areas of the U-boats and the US neutrality zone, everything was set up for encounters between the Kriegsmarine and the US Navy. In September 1941, there was an incident about 200 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. The destroyer USS Greer and the German submarine U-652 attacked each other, although both missed. Both sides assumed they were attacked by the other. Originally, a British recon plane attacked the submarine with depth charges and the captain assumed it was the destroyer. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the British plane was exchanging information with the US destroyer. Roosevelt used this incident and called the German attack piracy. And this is the origin for his rattlesnake quote. But when you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him. These Nazi submarines and raiders are the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. Besides this rhetoric, the speech also contained a new escalation. That means, very simply, very clearly, that our patrolling vessels and planes will protect all merchant ships, not only American ships, but ships of any flag, engaged in commerce in our defensive waters. Both Churchill and the German Navy Command interpreted this message basically the same way. Either Germany would lose the battle in the Atlantic or it had to be risked being engaged by US forces every time. Admiral Raeder called it a localized declaration of war, yet Hitler was still hoping for a successful Operation Barbarossa and ordered the prevention of any incidents with the United States. Likely the final straw for Hitler was the gutting of the US Neutrality Act on 15th November 1941. Dr. Schmider will give you now a brief overview about the law and how the change was received by Hitler.
Now, for the last 70 years or so, it's been assumed by historians that Hitler's declaration of war against the United States only makes sense when seen against the backdrop of an assumption on his part that war with the US was inevitable anyway. The problem is that until now, no historian has bothered to identify which particular fork in the road in German-American relations played a critical role here. There are any number of, we would say, times where this could have happened. Starting with the Destroyer for Bases deal of September 1940, moving on to the Lend-Lease Act of March of 1941, the occupation of Iceland, and the part-way escort for British convoys across the Atlantic. Any moment could have signaled to the German government that the United States were already in the process of making a commitment to going to war with Germany in the near future. However, the overwhelming evidence is that until about mid-November 1941, Hitler was committed to keeping the Americans out of the war, irrespective of anything the Japanese did or did not do. November 13th, this changes. November 13th sees the passing of a law which basically guts the neutrality legislation of 1939. And that means that from now on, American convoys with American crewed American merchantmen will sail straight into the ports of the Eastern Hemisphere. That also means that German bombers and U-boats will start to sink them in increasing numbers. Is this going to make a difference? It's going to make a difference insofar as torpedoings of US Navy vessels in the previous months have so far not ignited any outrage on the floor of Congress or amongst American voters. It's a different story when an American-flagged merchantman is hit, which did happen on 4 separate occasions in the North Atlantic and the Red Sea. And these events, even though they were nowhere near as calamitous as the sinking of the Lusitania, played an absolutely crucial role in helping Roosevelt to convince legislators that confrontation with Germany was something that was absolutely unavoidable. The proof is basically in a sequence of events that we can trace through a number of sources at Führer's headquarters in mid-November 1941. First of all, you have got a dictator who is utterly dejected at receiving the news of the American neutrality legislation being gutted, and literally for a couple of days is at his wit's end as to which course to pursue next. There's even talk, in a chat with Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, of possibly finding a way of, well, essentially seeking an off-ramp. Yeah, seeking an off-ramp to peace with the Anglo-American powers. It's only when the Japanese offer of an alliance essentially follows a few days later that Hitler decides to bank everything on a declaration of war.
So now we need to pull the strings together. At first we looked at the Ostfront. Here the German perception in December 1941 was that not only the Red Army was crippled, but the Soviet Union itself. And that it would be mostly waging a defensive campaign for the rest of the war. As we know, this was a fatal mistake. Yet the Soviets also assumed several times that the Wehrmacht was in its last leg. And well, it took them until summer 1944 to drive the Germans off Soviet soil. Second, the Japanese. Here the Japanese reluctance from the German perception is likely the key. Basically, Hitler wanted to seal the deal of the alliance by going all in. so the Japanese would not bug out again. Likely this was also to be viewed in the light of the pre-war and early war lack of coordination between Germany and Japan. In the midst of Zhukov's offensive in August 1939 with the Japanese 23rd Division literally fighting for its life, Japan's reputed ally Nazi Germany concluded a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This dramatic turnabout caused the fall of the cabinet in Tokyo and consternation throughout the army. Then again, two wrongs don't make a right. Finally, the US policy. Due to the US support for the United Kingdom and also the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease and other measures, followed by the extension of the neutrality zone on the Atlantic and various other moves, it became likely apparent that the war with the United States would just be a few months away. As such, Dr. Schmider concluded that Hitler saw a window of opportunity in December 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to declare war on the United States.
Essentially what we're left with is a perfect storm. In the last days of November and the very first days of December 1941, three factors come together. The German army in Russia is stalled, but there is as yet no indicator that the Red Army is in a position to capitalize on this by staging a major counterattack. On this, all kinds of officers, anti-Nazi ones included, are in agreement. Furthermore, conflict with the US in light of the recent gutting of the neutrality legislation at some point in the next few months appears increasingly likely. Finally, a Japanese offer of an offensive alliance against all Western powers is something on which Hitler does not feel he can rely on. Japanese policy in recent months and years has been erratic and unpredictable in the extreme, and frankly even seasoned Tokyo observers struggle at times to make any sense of the ups and downs of Japanese foreign policy and essentially the impulses which guide them. Hence, to somebody in Hitler's position, this is a unique opportunity which has to be seized with both hands before the brittle consensus for war in Japan might evaporate at any given time. Within a week of this decision, it will become clear to him that he has miscalculated on a catastrophic scale. It will become clear to him that the Russian counterattack is gathering pace, is no longer localized in nature, and that the German army in the east has basically its work cut out for it for a long, long time yet. But this is not apparent on the eve of December 11th, 1941. So we're really talking about a margin of 10 to 14 days where this decision is brought about.
Big thank you to Dr. Schmider, thank you to the Sandhurst Library and its staff for hosting this interview, thanks to Military Aviation History for recording it, and thanks to Andrew for reviewing the script. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.